Fantasy Intervention. Now here to intervene with your fantasy life, Dave Kluge.
Oh man, that music just gets me excited because that means it is showtime and we get to talk football for the next little bit. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Dave's Weekend Warmup. If you haven't been around for the last few weeks, be sure to check out the last episodes on youtube.com/fantasy intervention. Last week, we were joined by Football Guys owner Joe Bryant. We had the Fantasy Pros lead writer and analyst Mike Tagliari on the week prior. The week before that, we had PFF's Ian Harditz, and we're going to keep the momentum going today with the one and only JJ Zachariason, editor-in-chief for Numberfire. Before I introduce you, JJ, I wanted to congratulate you because I saw that you just won FSWA's Podcast of the Year. So that is awesome. But for anyone that doesn't know who you are, why don't you let them know where they can find you, what you've got going on this offseason, and a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate it, man. It was really cool. So I'm the editor-in-chief at Numberfire and FanDuel, and I host the Late Round Podcast, which is what was the podcast that ended up winning that award. And that's really, what a lot of my effort goes into these days is doing that show. I do a couple of them a week during the off season, 4 of them a week in season. But then on top of that, we have content going on over on Numberfire constantly. And so, I'm managing that team and making sure that we're pushing some good stuff each and every day. And then I also tweet really poorly. That's really the basis of my job at this point.
Hey man, I think you've got a phenomenal presence on Twitter. There was one thing that you did that just caught me so off guard, and I was laughing so hard this season. I forget what it even was, but there were these guys that were just going back and forth and arguing for like 35 comments, and then you just jumped in. You were like, "Hey guys, let's play nice here," and it just something about that struck a chord and made me laugh so hard. For anyone that's unfamiliar with Numberfire, it's a great website that'll just help you across the board in fantasy sports. Whatever it is that you're playing, whether it's football, basketball, baseball, golf, even NASCAR, they've just got you covered with a fantastic team of content creators over there. They've also got a section called OddsFire that will help you make some analytically based decisions if you're getting into sports betting. So be sure to check it out. They were recently acquired by FanDuel, and they've just been growing ever since they started. They've got a great thing going over there. And then I also want to introduce my co-host today, Troy King, the one and only. Everyone knows who Troy is. Why don't you go ahead and let everyone know what you've got going on right now, Troy? I know you're all over the place doing a million things at once.
You're right. I don't think everybody knows me just yet. Maybe one day, but not quite. But as you said, I'm a writer for Ball Blast Football. I'm also a writer for Fantasy Intervention, join our circle, and I am one of the co-hosts of Fantasy Football Confidential. So I got a lot going on, and I'm just happy to be here. But before we get into the show, JJ, I gotta ask you a question, man. I've been here listening to your pod for a while, and you've probably been asked this before, but you always do a signature pause in your intro. So can you tell us the story behind it and why you do it?
I don't know, honestly. I don't know when it started. So like you said, I do my canned intro every time, what's up everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, this is episode whatever. And then at the end, I don't really know where it came from, but there was one episode a really long time ago where I paused at the end of that intro, and then I always say thanks for tuning in. But one time I paused a little bit too long, and the way that it was edited and stuff. And I paused for like 3 or 4 seconds before saying thanks for tuning in. Someone caught it and said something to me. So then usually when for instance, if you listen to a mailbag episode or something like that, I have these little sound drops. It sounds like I can't even I don't even know what it is. Well, you got the air horns, and then in between little segments, it'll be like a like this little sound that happens to split up the podcast a little bit. And one time someone hit me up. This was episode 40. I mean, it's really, really old for it was, a few years ago. And he hit me up, and he just starts like trashing the he just starts trashing the sound that I was using. And so what I did was, in between, throughout the episode, I just threw in like random like dogs barking and like chickens making noises and stuff like that, just to troll them a little bit. So the pause game, I think, probably comes from this, like, I mean, I love trolling back. I love jabbing back at people.
I know.
Yeah. I mean, it's fun. Like, if people are going to come at me, I'm going to have fun back. Why not? I mean, that's the point of social media in a way. I mean, I don't provoke it. I'm not the one who starts that kind of stuff. But so, like, I think the pause game, sort of started with someone like making fun of the way it was edited, and then sometimes I'll stretch that thing for like 10 seconds and have people check and see if their phone is still on and stuff like that. It's fun time.
I've done that before.
Did I take my headphones off? Did I get unplugged?
Yeah, exactly.
Nice. So today's show, we're gonna get to know JJ a little bit. Anyone that's watched the show before knows that we're not just diving straight into the numbers. We want to get to know the person that we're bringing on here a little bit. So we're gonna have some questions to get to know JJ a little bit. Kind of talk about his come up in the industry, his process that has proven to have so much success over the years, and how he's adapted to the changing landscape. We're going to talk a little bit about the potential quarterback shuffle that we're going to see this offseason. And finally, we're going to wrap it up talking about some sophomore campaigns that we are really excited for next season. So JJ, the first question I got for you is a pretty simple one. Troy and I, we're both new to the industry, but we work hard. I'm writing, I do at least one show a week. I'm editing articles for the fantasy intervention team. Troy, he's on a live show just about every single day of the week. He's writing for like 5 different websites. And then I see you, and you wear more hats than almost anybody in the industry when it comes to podcasts and writing and editing for all these different publications. So, what I want to know is just how you manage to do all of this at once, between writing books and podcasts and articles. What's your trick to doing so much in this industry?
Yeah, I mean, look, to be fair, I've been doing this now since, full time since 2013. So it's been sort of a long time. I'm not that old, but I've been around, at least, within the space. Met a lot of great people, and it's an awesome community to be a part of, for sure. But the one thing that I will say, obviously I've written a book, and I wrote an ebook, and I've done this podcast, and I have another podcast that I do, and I manage, and I help manage the writing team that we have over on Number Fire. But it hasn't all happened at once. It's definitely, I give the amount of time and effort that other people are spending doing things on top of having a full-time job. I was there before. But I mean, it's more work doing that than it is once, now that I'm doing this as my job. So it's just been sort of like a gradual, building up my portfolio, if you will, doing things. But I will say, one of the things that has helped me is just really figuring out ways to be efficient and with my time and what I'm doing, and making sure that what I'm focused on is really actually getting me to, where I need to be, and differentiating myself and standing out in some way within what's now become a really, really crowded and saturated space. And so to me, it's really about like finding and making sure that you're focused on, and your goals are set to focus on the things that you're really, really, truly trying to accomplish, and not just kind of getting that filler stuff, just to make you feel like you're getting the stuff done. And it will make you feel like you're working really hard and getting the stuff done. But, there's some stuff that you can shed and maybe outsource or send to this person or that person and get them involved, and then build that team. And that's sort of what I've tried to do with Number Fire in particular, where, when I started at Number Fire back in 2013, we didn't have a writing staff at all. There was no one there. And so I was the person that was writing a lot of content. I mean, I was 24 years old at the time. I mean, I had no idea really what I was doing for the most part. And so it was a lot of just like trial and error and trying to figuring stuff out that way. But, in the end, I surrounded myself with people who did things that I knew that I couldn't do, and sort of building up a team that, a lot of the guys are still hanging around and still editing content, and we're still, moving up within FanDuel and just doing bigger and better things.
That's awesome to hear, because we are still very much, over at Fantasy Intervention in those early stages where you see, Chase is at work right now, and he's helping us out backstage. We've got Troy cutting out of work early too the last 3 weeks to help co-host this show for me. So we're still, working with that work-life balance, and then trying to get fantasy in there as well. So all too familiar. But you mentioned your ebook that you wrote, and that's obviously something that you have leaned pretty heavily into drafting a late round quarterback. You wrote the book, it's in your Twitter handle, and really it's a draft process that has kind of become a little bit mainstream now, and a lot of people are doing. So I've got a question for you, and that is, with the rise of larger leagues and super flex spots and all of that stuff, where do you kind of draw the line and start taking a quarterback a little bit early? Because you can't always wait for a quarterback with all of the new forms of drafting nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the format for sure. So, I've done a super flex study before. It was a few years ago where, the numbers still pointed that to the fact that people are generally paying up way too much at the quarterback position, even in a super flex league, than they need to. And again, this was before this past season. So, this past season has changed things a little bit. I'll get to that in a second. But, generally speaking, you can even wait in super flex leagues because of a lot of reasons. I mean, the quarterback position is predictable, which gives you an edge from a week to week standpoint and trying to figure out who to start. And so you can stream effectively, but in a super flex league, instead of thinking about streaming, you're thinking more about platooning and drafting 3 or 4 guys that you can just throw in based on matchup each week. So there are reasons as to why quarterbacks would be overvalued in super flex leagues still. But the main takeaway, when I wrote that ebook, the late round quarterback strategy, I mean, just to give you some perspective, like the 8th round at that time was where the 12th quarterback was being drafted in most fantasy leagues. I mean, last season, that was where the 6th quarterback was being drafted, right? So if back in 2012, it was cool and I was cool with it to draft a quarterback in the 8th round because of opportunity cost and et cetera, then realistically, I should be fine drafting a quarterback in the 8th round now, where he's the QB6. Last year, like I said, that's where guys like Russell Wilson were being drafted. So I do think that it really comes down to the fact that the late round quarterback strategy, the ebook, it was always about value above all else. It wasn't this game of chicken where you had to be the last person to draft a quarterback. It was just the fact that so many people were drafting quarterbacks earlier than they should. And so as a result of that, the market dictated that you should be waiting to draft a quarterback. So, as things evolve and change, the strategy should change and your approach should change. And last season, entering the season, I got plenty of stuff wrong. But the one thing that I feel really good about was my approach at the quarterback position, because last year, of all the years in doing this and analyzing this game, I had never seen what appeared to be such an efficient quarterback market from looking at things at an ADP perspective. Because you finally had a season where these guys who could throw the ball well, sure, but also have that rushing component to their game, they finally were being elevated and valued properly. We had never seen that before. There was always easy guys to pinpoint later in drafts because they had that rushing ability, or you could say this guy has touchdown regression coming, et cetera. But this past year, it was really tough to find that late round quarterback and find that guy. And so that forced me, I did a study on it, and that forced me to get like a lot of Josh Allen last year. Now, granted, I didn't get a lot of like Stephon Diggs last year, but it was one of those scenarios though, where I felt good about, within this space, it's really, really important to not have take lock. And it's really important to just own your mistakes and be cool with it and understand that the variance exists, and I'm going to get stuff wrong. You're going to get stuff wrong. And that's what I try to do as an analyst. And I think that's really what the late round quarterback strategy is really all about. In the end, it's about looking at the market and trying to figure out value that way.
I was going to say, one of my favorite things that you do is that on your pod, you every week, or especially during the season, you mention, hey, if you got something wrong or something didn't work out, you own it. And I believe that everybody should, own up to it, because look, everyone gets things wrong all the time. So that's probably one of my favorite things. Like, hey, you're not afraid because look, you got a lot of hits too. So it's okay to be wrong sometimes. I think everybody's just trying to be right all the time. It's okay to accept that, hey, you're not going to always be right every single time. So
yeah, it's tough. I mean, we're talking fantasy football here, right? I mean, anything that you're I mean, the thing that's like crazy, like if you were to work with someone who's working in like supply chain or something, or what have something like that you can get, whatever the industry is, but something, if you work with like correlations or something, the correlations that people are going to be working with, when I throw out, oh man, I found this statistic that has an R squared of 30.35. And I'm like, man, I'm really excited about this. Someone would look at me and be like, that's a strong correlation for you, because nothing in football really has that strong of a correlation, because there's so much variance involved, whether it's because there's a short season, so the sample size is smaller, but also the fact that there's so many things that have to go certain ways in a given game. So, the data that we're working with, the things that we're working with, they're not really set in stone. So just embrace that variance and understand that it exists.
Yeah, absolutely. That's some great insight. And that kind of brings me to my next question a little bit, because, you said that the times have changed. And I think one of the big reasons that has changed is because of a lot of the work that you've put into this industry, helping people kind of reshape the way that they look at their team and construct their rosters. So, with quarterbacks and their values starting to change a little bit, what is the biggest market inefficiency that a savvy manager can capitalize on in today's game? Like, if you were to start from scratch rather than late round QB, what would the book of your second ebook, or the name of your second ebook, be?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what you read and consume in the fantasy space is based on hindsight analysis. And it's fine to do descriptive analysis. We need to do that descriptive analysis to understand what had just happened in history and why that just happened and occurred. But a lot of times what I see is people then taking what is very clearly descriptive and trying to make it predictive. And so a good example, let me just give you an example of that. So I did a massive study a few years ago on running back handcuffs and the viability of handcuffing running backs. And what I found in that study is that, number one, running back handcuffs very, very rarely pan out. But when they do pan out, or when a running back actually gets his opportunity as a backup and steps into a starting running back role, he very rarely is even all that good from a fantasy perspective. And so we look back and we say, oh, but D'Angelo Williams, the 1 year that Le'Veon Bell sat out. And it's like, okay, I get it. You're using this hindsight example to sort of prove and talk yourself into buying into these handcuffs that, and there's ways that you can define handcuffs. That's the one thing too, is that, you have to define it in a certain way, and everyone's going to have a different definition of it. But regardless, generally speaking, the backup running backs who are emerging are not emerging on teams with a stud running back, which would be a handcuff. They're emerging on teams with ambiguous backfields. So, the real angle that you should go after is these ambiguous backfields where, there's a questionable starter, as opposed to getting a Tony Pollard and hoping for the Zeke injury, or getting an Alexander Madison and hoping for a Dalvin Cook injury, because you're wasting a roster space by doing that. There's a lot of it's just not necessary. I do it mid-season where there's not cost in doing so. But during your draft, when you have to spend a 10th rounder on a guy like that, when there's still viable options, at positions that you could use as starters, it's just not really worth it. But if you look at analysis, it's always like, this guy stepped into this role, so therefore you should be drafting handcuffs. But, I think that the one thing that you should really do as a fantasy manager, and one way you can gain an edge immediately, is by looking at, not just what happened, but putting yourselves in the shoes of what you were doing when you were making those decisions, when you were actively making those decisions. So it's really easy to say that you can get running backs off the waiver wire, but how many of those running back performances off the waiver wire were actually predictive? How many of those wide receiver performances could you actually predict happening? And when you did predict them, were they then predictable week in and week out from there? So it's just really important to put yourself in the shoes of yourself back in week 3 when you are making those decisions, because that's really how you end up winning fantasy football. You don't win fantasy football after the fact. You win it during.
I'm still scarred from Mike Boone, by the way, in the playoffs. So
yeah, right.
I completely understand.
It's a perfect example. Yeah, it's a perfect example. I mean, look, it's not like these guys never pan out when they step in. It's just that over the larger sample, I think the equivalent running back that I threw out there from a production standpoint, because I wrote this in like 2017, but the guy that produced essentially the same as running backs who had an injured starter, where these guys stepped in for the injured starter, they averaged the same amount of points as Jalen Richard did. And this was before like Richard was even like doing anything. Right. So like, it's just, don't just take these narratives to heart and think that they exist. I mean, dig into it yourself and try to figure out if there's really something to it.
And that's a fantastic mindset to have, because so many people want to have the handcuff because it's such a black and white situation. If this guy gets hurt, then I'm going to have this guy to play. And a lot of people don't want to take the risk on somebody like last year. People didn't want Cam Akers because Darrell Henderson was in the mix. And,
right.
If you took that chance and kept Cam Akers and held him all year, hoping for that talent to pop, it paid off for you. So that's a great way to kind of get ahead of the curve and change the way that the narrative is a little bit. Now, I certainly don't want to typecast you as an analytics guy, because I know that you watch a ton of football as well. But if you had to err on one side, it would probably be that you're a little bit more on the analytics side. And then you've got other people that are firmly on the film side. So I want to ask you, because you have this process that just is so I don't want to say perfect, but I mean, it's pretty spot on, the process and the method that you have. But then when you're watching football, I'm wondering who's somebody that, there's a big gap between your process and what you see, where, it looks like they're going to have a great season, but then when you watch them on film, you're just not really seeing it. And then, kind of vice versa, somebody who pops on film for you that your method is saying isn't going to be a great player this year.
Yeah, so someone who pops on film that generally I've shied away from so far is Josh Jacobs. He's someone who I think is good. Don't get me wrong. I'm definitely a believer in the talent, and I understand why people view him the way they view him from a film perspective. But I do think there's some divide with like the traditional film watcher, if you will, and then how Josh Jacobs has actually produced and performed on the field. I mean, this past year, I'm not a big yards per carry guy per se, but he had an under 4 yards per carry. And if you compare that yards per carry to his running back teammate yards per carry, it was 0.65 yards per carry below his teammate's average. So he didn't have a good season this past year. And then on top of that, you have a guy who has not been, it's strange because Jacobs came out of college and to me, it was like, oh, he's definitely going to be a pass catcher at the NFL level because that's what he does best. And he hasn't hit a 10% target share yet in his 2 seasons in the NFL. And so, at some point you have to, and it's a similar trajectory as what we saw with like a Joe Mixon, but the difference is that at least Mixon, last year and at times has shown somewhat of a receiving ceiling, whereas Jacobs just hasn't shown that yet. We thought that it was going to hit this year after that week 1 game against Carolina, and then it just really didn't happen. And we know that the surrounding situation for him, the offensive line's good, sure, but the surrounding situation for him with the Raiders isn't superb necessarily. So I think all of that just combined, yes, I understand why film watchers love him the way they do, but he's a top 10 dynasty or a fringe like top, first round dynasty asset. He's at least a top 10 running back. And to me, it's just a little bit too rich, just given what we've seen so far.
Yeah, I just read a tweet the other day that blew my mind that Nick Chubb averaged more yards after contact than Josh Jacobs averaged per carry overall. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's somebody where, you see it. I mean, he runs hard and he looks like he's going to get it done. And then you look at his output every single week and it just isn't there, unfortunately. Right. So I wanted to mention, I couldn't find exactly how many podcasts you did, but I saw that you are approaching 500 just on your solo podcast. And then I'm sure guest appearances, all that, you are probably approaching 1,000 here. But something I noticed is that you don't bring on a lot of guests. You like to do your podcast solo. I'm wondering, is there a reason for that?
It's sort of, I'd say, so the first thing I want to say is one of the things that I really love about doing a solo podcast is that, if you do a show with someone else, you're constantly getting feedback on the things that you're saying. So, if you guys are talking about, running backs next season or something like that, and Troy comes up and says, I really like Myles Gaskin. I know he's a Dolphins guy. I really like Myles Gaskin. And then, Dave, you're sitting there and you're like, no, I like David Montgomery, X, Y, and Z. This is why. Then you guys are immediately hearing the take of the opposition or someone who agrees or disagrees with you. And there's comfort in that, right? Because you're able to say, like, if you say something that is outlandish, the other person on the show is going to bring you down a little bit. Like, even if it's subconscious, I mean, it's just happening, right? Whereas what I have realized over the last maybe like year or so, not when I first started this, but doing the solo show, but more recently, what I've realized is I kind of like the thrill of like putting together this show, and I edit and produce everything on the show. And so I'm doing the whole show from start to finish. No one's listening to it before it's released, not one person other than me. And so I could be throwing this thing out there, and I'm always worried that like something was edited wrong or something. And, I'm going to just, my mentions are going to be blown up in the morning whenever, whenever people start listening to it. But what I really enjoy about it is that like my true takes without any sort of filter from a fantasy perspective are going out there into the world, and people are listening to it and engaging with it. And you're not getting some filtered down take. And I've realized that I sort of enjoy that because I'm able to get all of the fantasy football takes that I have off my chest onto the show and do it in a concise way. And I think that's sort of unique and something that you don't get on a show with multiple. I mean, I have Living the Stream, and I have another show where I have a podcast co-host, and I love going back and forth. I definitely love talking to people. I mean, that's something that I love to do, but there's just a different component and dynamic to the solo show that I really enjoy.
Yeah, it's a much more vulnerable type of content.
Yeah,
You're really putting
yeah.
yourself out there for everybody to rip you apart after you've made your fact.
Yeah.
I know what
And
you
people
mean.
do. People do, and sometimes deservedly so. Yeah.
Hey, it's like that sometimes, but yeah, that's a good way to look at it. That when you have multiple people on a show, you do get some more watered down takes because everyone's kind of leveling each other out. So I like that insight. Thank you for that,
Dave. You gotta stop watering down my takes, man. Now JJ inspired me. Now I know what to do going forward. So thank you.
Oh
JJ.
man, just be careful, man. Troy's gonna be going live by himself every single day now on lunch.
Twitter. Yeah, you're gonna see me. What's up, y'all? JJ told me to do this.
So we already mentioned it, JJ, but you wear so many different hats in the industry as a writer, an editor, a podcast host, and then you're guesting today. I know you were just on the 14 Personnel podcast on Wednesday. So of all those different roles that you currently have in the industry, what is your favorite? I mean, what do you prefer?
I would probably say, I love podcasting. I really enjoy podcasting because I'm pretty casual in nature. I don't really like. I've done some TV stuff, and it's not really my. I don't feel as comfortable. Whereas just kind of hanging out and talking to people in a more casual way, and if I'm doing my solo podcast, I have a lot more control over what I'm able to say. And I think the reason I like the podcasting medium as much as I do is because you're able to have more nuance with your takes. Whereas, like I go on radio. I hate going on radio. No offense to people who do radio. I'm not super into radio because it's a little bit more takey, right? You're not able to really dive in to why you're feeling the way that you're feeling. And I think that's the most important part to analysis. It's not the I feel this way. It's the why do you feel this way? And you're able to do that with podcasting more than any other medium, in my opinion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'm gonna shoot from the cuff here and kind of put you on the spot. But you've done a lot of shows with some big names, with athletes, coaches, analysts, whatever. Of all the people that you've created content with before, who do you think is your favorite person that you've had an opportunity to just sit down and talk or write with?
I'll say two guys.
Right.
So I gotta say my guy Denny Carter, who I do Living the Stream with, because we've been doing it together for a while, and we just have like a very brotherly vibe at this point. And it's fun. It's just a really, really fun show for us to be ourselves. So I gotta give Denny a shout out here. But then another guy who I just appreciate and is sort of my sounding board when it comes to takes, and if I have an idea and I need to run it past someone to make sure it makes sense. If I'm writing an article or doing a study, it's Rich Rebar of Sharp Football Analysis. So Rich he works for Sharp Football Analysis, and he's sharp. He is one of the smartest people that I've met within this fantasy football world. The guy, he definitely is like-minded as I am in terms of the way that we approach the game of fantasy. But again, I think he's just a better version in terms of the actual analysis. I think of game theory things a little bit differently than he does, but the player analysis side from him is just incredible. And then he also is just able to like give me that backbone a little bit and that push if I'm thinking about a game theory component a little bit differently, or if I'm going and approaching a certain game theory topic in a different way. He's able to at least let me know if it makes sense or not. So he's someone that I've just, him and I are really tight now. Him and Denny have really grown a great friendship throughout, the last 7 or 8 years or so. And I just really appreciate what he's been able to do for me.
Awesome. Yeah, we've actually got Rich coming on in just about a month here. He'll be joining this show, so we're excited to have him. And I'm kind of I like talking to people that have a very different process than I do, because it forces me to challenge my own preconceived notions. Yeah. I'm sure Jacob Sanderson, on our team, he's probably watching this right now. He's one of my favorite guys to chop it up with. We rarely agree on anything, but I love that because it forces me to think outside of the box. So having people like that is awesome. Yeah. So I asked this question to everybody that I have on the show. And this is the last kind of personal question we'll have, and then we can jump into a little bit of actual fantasy talk here. But there are a lot of people that are watching this show that are trying to make it in the industry, and you have, by all intents and purposes, made it at this point. So what advice would you have to somebody that is trying to come up in this industry and be the next JJ Zacharyson?
Yeah, look, first don't try to be me. I don't think that's probably not a great idea. But no, I think that actually has some validity, only because you shouldn't be following someone else's path, in my opinion. I think the whole point to trying to stand out is to try to stand out. You're trying to be different, right? And in order to be different, you have to think of ways to create content that people have not seen yet in the space. I mean, you can do that in a lot of different ways. It can be from the perspective of the specific content that you're creating. Don't just put a rankings list together and throw it out there. I said this on the 14 personnel show that you referenced, but no one barely knows who I am. No one knows who people are who are putting together these rankings and just spitting them out. You just have to be realistic about it. If you have a following that's not gigantic, and I'm talking like, Matthew Berry style, just shooting out rankings, you shouldn't assume that people are going to care about that, because what's the difference between yours and someone else's? It's just, that's the truth, and that's the hard truth. But so try to be different with the type of content that you're creating. Look across the landscape and look at the people who have done well. It's Matt Harmon. It's what he did with reception perception. Rich Rebar and what he did with worksheets. Graham Barfield, what he did with yards created. There's these very, very interesting ways of looking at the game, and they're approaching their content with this lens of differentiation. And then on top of that, you don't even have to think about it from a content standpoint and like what you're actually creating. Think of it from a medium perspective and how you're channeling that content. And that's really honestly the way that I tried to look at like the Late Round podcast. I think the reason why there are a ton of people who just don't like the Late Round podcast. That's fine. It's not for them, right? Because it's not a common thing to find a 15 to 20 minute fantasy football podcast that's usually a solo show and it's very analytically heavy. But one of the reasons why and then I'll get the feedback where people are like, I just wish the episodes were longer. And I'm like, that's the point. The point is that they're short. That's the entire point of the Late Round podcast, is that you're able to consume it in a commute. You're able to consume it going to the grocery store, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was the way to sort of differentiate that show versus what else was out there, which is usually hour-long shows. There's nothing wrong I have an hour-long show. There's nothing wrong with those shows. It's just that, there's just small things that you can tweak to think of things, to creating content in a slightly different way. And that to me is the way that you sort of start to rise within this space, which, like I said earlier, it's a fairly saturated space. You got to do something to really stand out.
Oh, I was going to say, so the Late Round podcast, right? You understand how much time you've saved me. Because there have been times where everyone gets busy. Everyone has lives. Everyone gets busy. So again, I love the hour-long content as well. But sometimes I'm like, I'm busy with work. I haven't been able to research any fantasy. Let me put a Late Round podcast at only 15, 20 minutes. I get what I need, and I can move on and do whatever else I need to do. So I love that. And like you said, it's different. That's one of the reasons I fell in love with it, because, hey, I needed it. I'm a busy guy, so it just fit my schedule. So yeah.
And look, I'm not. If someone hits me up and they say I can't do the show because because it is heavily edited, I make sure that I'm not stumbling over words, so I'll even re-record some stuff, and I'll make sure that it's very. I mean, I say this all the time, but recording a 15-minute show for the Late Round podcast takes me double the amount of time of recording an hour-long show for another podcast, where I'm just going back and forth and talking to someone, because I want it to be that way. I want it to be super consumable. Like you just went nuts for 15 minutes, just consuming all this fantasy football stuff. And like I always say on the show too, it's just my brain vomit. So if I'm sitting there and letting you guys know how I'm handling the waiver wire, or how I'm handling buys and sells, I'm going to do it as quick as I possibly can, but I want to do it with some substance so that you at least understand the why. But again, like you said, Troy, I'm really trying to make it quick and consumable for people, because people are busy and not everyone can sit and listen to an hour-long show where there are lots and lots of takes, and they're not always super concise, and that's fine. I just needed to stand out and wanted it to stand out in some way.
Yeah, and plus one to Troy's comment, because I love how easily digestible that is. I mean, there's a lot of information crammed in there. But anytime somebody says, hey, why don't you make this a little bit longer? Just remember, no, Dave and Troy said that they like it at 15 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate it. And look, I like all that feedback. I think it's really important. I've taken a lot of that feedback and I've pushed it onto the show, because I think it's important to, objectively look at it. But there are some things like the make the show longer that I'm not budging on. That's the way the show is. It's a 15 to 20 minute show usually. Sometimes I get crazy, and I'll tell you what too, when you're talking for a half hour straight, I'll be done recording and I'll be dripping sweat. I'll get so hot in here, and it's just I get so heated talking about this stuff. Nothing nothing is just more fun and gets you sweating more than thinking about DeAndre Swift's 40 time. So,
hey man, if you're talking about DeAndre Swift, this whole team over here is in love with DeAndre.
Twitter. I can't go a day without seeing DeAndre
everyone
Swift.
loves DeAndre Swift. Yes.
Yeah. So I do some work with Fantasy Pros, and I put out that story yesterday about him. They said he's going to be a 25 touch or more back in 2021, and my mentions were blown up all day, man. You say that DeAndre Swift is getting 25 touches a day, and people get pretty crazy about it.
Yeah.
So let's dive into some, player specific questions here. Talk a little bit about what to expect in 2021. The first thing I want to talk about is the quarterback situation. I mean, there have been so many rumors with free agency and trades and retirement and all this stuff. So what is one situation that you would love to see play out for fantasy purposes? If you could have any one player that's on the block or a free agent, go to any one team, what would be your just absolute favorite scenario?
Yeah, it kind of popped today a little bit. It was news today. Deshaun Watson going to Denver would be something. The weapons there are incredible. Look, they didn't have Cortland Sutton for almost the entire season this year. And I think Jerry Jeudy, the way I view, I brought this up in my podcast, I think earlier this week, but the way I view Jeudy and Sutton is similar to a Ridley Julio situation where you have the clear X with Sutton, and then you have Jeudy and Ridley being sort of that perfect complement to that size. And then obviously you got KJ Hamler now, you got Noah Fant and Alberto. And we already know Deshaun, the offensive line isn't as big for such a mobile guy like Deshaun Watson. So I think that would be an unbelievable spot for him. In that Denver air, it would just be a lot of fun to see that offense.
But JJ, he's supposed to go to the Dolphins. JJ,
I will say, Troy.
I thought he was coming to Chicago.
So last year I did a draft show, a draft stream with Jim Sonis and Brandon Gadula, my coworkers, and I mentioned on the show that I became a Dolphins fan, like on that show, because it's like sort of because of the draft, but just the way the front office was moving and stuff. Because I grew up a Steelers fan. I still am a Steelers fan, but it's just hard for me to not really a fan of anything.
Mason Rudolph.
Yeah, exactly. I'm more so, I still love when the Steelers win. I don't really, I'm not really hurt whenever they lose. It's not that big of a deal to me anymore. It's really weird because I used to be such a diehard. I just have to look at football as objectively as I can now. It just kind of ruins fandom a little bit, but it makes up for it just because I get to do this now.
Well, you set that up perfectly for the next question, because the next question I have is about the Steelers.
Mm-hmm.
All signs right now are pointing to Juju Smith-Schuster getting out of town. Who knows where he's going to end up? But one thing is for certain, and that is that Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool are both going to be on the roster next year. You've got two very different type of players, but two very high ceiling players as well. So between those two guys, Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool, who's your preferred wide receiver going into 2021 and why?
Yeah, so if you were to ask me this a year ago, entering last year, or which player was going to have a better career, I would have easily said Deontay Johnson. I was not a huge Chase Claypool guy coming out. I really was worried about how he would separate at the NFL level. And then Deontay Johnson, great route runner, showed a lot his rookie year. I mean, that rookie class that he was in 2 years ago, it was pretty studly. A lot of great wide receiver. DK Metcalf, AJ Brown, Terry McLaurin. Deontay Johnson with the aforementioned Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges led that rookie class in receptions. That alone spoke to me and said, clearly there's something there. So, great route runner. He's just really solid, a really solid player. And I know a lot of people are hating on Deontay for his low yards per target and his efficiency metrics. But just keep in mind that targets are earned. They wouldn't be throwing him the ball, whether it's low A dot, high A dot. They wouldn't be throwing him the ball as frequently as they did this past year if he was not good with the ball in his hands. And if he wasn't open. So I am a Deontay stan. Now, with that being said, I'm going with Chase Claypool with this answer.
I'm surprised.
Yeah. So if anyone listened to the Late Round podcast last year, they know that I'm a big Deontay guy because I talked him up a lot. And I didn't with Claypool until maybe, I liked him as like a speculative ad at one point, but that was the extent of it. But Claypool, I really look at Dynasty, especially from the perspective of just guys who I want the ceiling. And the way that I sort of view Chase Claypool right now, I get similar vibes as I did with like DK Metcalf last year, where you have this specimen, and the difference between like a Metcalf and a Chase Claypool is that Metcalf's tied to one of the best quarterbacks in the league, and Claypool doesn't have the offensive line or quarterback right now. So there's that downside. But if you look at history since the late 90s, of the rookie wide receivers who scored 10 plus touchdowns, that's all purpose touchdowns. You have Randy Moss, Mike Williams, who was a bust after about 3 years. Mike Evans. I'm not talking Mike. I'm talking old Mike Williams, not.
I thought you were.
Yeah. So it's Randy Moss, Mike Williams, Mike Evans, Odell Beckham, Tyreek Hill, and Calvin Ridley. Those are the guys. Those are the guys who hit 10 plus touchdowns during their rookie season as wide receivers. I just think that he's fairly bust proof at this point. I'm buying him everywhere. I had a startup in January. I drafted him there. I just think that Chase Claypool has the potential to be, I can see him rising up dynasty rankings and being a true like top 5, top 6 guy at some point.
Yeah, I mean, you want to talk about pure athleticism. I mean, yeah, you said DK Metcalf, but it's like DK Metcalf, AJ Brown, Chase Claypool. Those guys are in a tier of their own when it comes to athleticism. Troy, what do you have to say about this one? Are you more of a DJ guy, or are you leaning a little bit more towards Claypool?
So I'm a Deontay Johnson guy. Look, but let's talk about Claypool. Man, now after that performance, I really wish he ended up being a tight end. Imagine if he was a tight end right now.
Oh my God.
But I digress. But I think it's Deontay Johnson. I mean, I understand all your arguments, JJ. They were excellent. And obviously, DJ has the issues with the drops, but I don't really care about that. He's going to get targeted no matter what. I've just been impressed with him since his rookie year. He's my guy. And I think Claypool is going to be just fine. He's going to be really, really good. But I just believe that Deontay Johnson is still going to be the number one target. So I'm going to follow the targets. And past performance shows that he's still going to be that number one guy on the team. So I'm going to go DJ.
Yeah, I just love what the Steelers do when it comes to drafting wide receivers. It seems like every team kind of has a type, and the Steelers are all over the place. They'll take a guy that's 5'10", that runs a 4.3. They'll take somebody like Claypool. I mean, they're just all over the place, but it seems like they always get solid production out of that wide receiver core. So I got one more question about Pittsburgh, and this one we don't have to dive too deep into, but obviously Big Ben isn't getting any younger. He's missed at least one game in 5 of his last 6 seasons. And then we saw Dwayne Haskins get pulled in there. So is this something that, we should even be looking at for fantasy purposes? Do we think we're going to see Dwayne Haskins there, or is he going to be a, camp casualty? What do we expect with Dwayne Haskins in Pittsburgh?
I mean, look, these are one of those situations where if you're in a super flex league and you have like a deep rookie draft and you have 6th rounders, sure, go for it, toss that over there, maybe even a 5th. Like, let's just see what happens and if they bite. But it's really hard to buy into it. I do think it's intriguing, and I think that from a real football standpoint, it was a great move. It was a very low risk move where you're at least matching Haskins with a coach who's been able to handle. I know that people give Tomlin a hard time sometimes that he can't handle these big personalities and these issues off the field. Look what happened to Antonio Brown when he left Pittsburgh, right? I mean, look what happened to even Le'Veon Bell to a degree. I mean, Tomlin was keeping that within the team, and it wasn't leaking that much. And then they get let go and all hell breaks loose. So I think Tomlin's a great coach for a player like this. And obviously the style of Haskins matches up fairly similarly to Ben Roethlisberger. So he'd have a year there. I do think Ben's going to come back. So he'll have a year there with Ben. Do I think he's going to be a long-term answer? No, I don't think so.
That's a great way to put it, though. I didn't even think about that. Tomlin's track history with, some players that have had some issues. That's a really great way to look at it. Now we're going to wrap up the show. I want to talk about one more thing here. Right now, everybody's talking about rookies. I don't want to talk about rookies yet because so much about these rookies is going to depend on where they get drafted in April. So I want to talk about last year's rookies, guys that are about to head into their sophomore year. I mean, this is maybe one of the most loaded rookie classes I have ever seen. I can't remember rookies coming in and just taking over the league the way that we saw this year. So I want to go through position by position and see what sophomore, second year guy you are most excited about heading into next year. So let's start with quarterbacks. Obviously, Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, Tua, Jalen Hurts. I'm sure somebody out there is hoping for Jacob Eason, but who's the guy that you're most excited about? Troy, let's start with you on this one.
I hate this question because obviously, as a Dolphins fan, I would like to say Tua, but I'm not going to say Tua. I got to go with Jalen Hurts, man. I mean, this what he showed us at the end of the season last year. obviously with the rushing, he has the Konami code. We already know how effective rushing quarterbacks are. So it's just another piece that we weren't expecting to be relevant. I didn't draft him anyway, especially in Dynasty. Like I faded him because I didn't expect him to get an opportunity so quickly. But now we have to talk about him as he could easily be a QB1. Like it's very, very realistic. Unless I don't believe that they're going to, do anything different. They're going to trade Carson Wentz. Is he the guy? That he's going to be, to me, by far the most interesting. It's going to be a Lamar kind of, ceiling. I don't know. I don't think he's going to be like Lamar of 2 years ago, but I bet all of them are going to be good, but I'm trying to get Jalen Hurts everywhere I can.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, Jalen Hurts is just kind of screaming what Kyler Murray was last year, that second-year player that's just posed for a breakout. What about you, JJ? Which quarterback are you most excited about next year?
Yeah, I mean, I love Hurts. It's going to be really interesting. I think Hurts is going to be such an easy redraft target. Maybe a little bit different from a dynasty perspective because, how long is that gig going to be his and yada, yada, yada. But I'm still buying overall. But I'll go with Joe Burrow, mainly because, you have the injuries. There's some question marks there. But you look at his situation, offensive line probably going to improve. The weapons are there. Love T. Higgins. I think he's a stud. And then, obviously, Joe Mixon will be back and healthy. You got a receiving threat of the backfield if they want to use him. And then on top of that, Burrow not only had a really low touchdown rate this past year, which shows some positive regression that should hit. But on top of that, he's got some rushing ability himself. So I really, if Burrow were someone who was completely healthy, no question marks, entering next season, I think that if you were looking at like a really late quarterback to target and redraft, it would probably be him. I'm not talking like Hurts because I think Hurts will still be like a low end QB1 from an ADP standpoint. More so, in that like mid QB2 range. I think Burrow would make a lot of sense just given the improvements that'll probably happen around him in Cincinnati and the fact that he does have rushing ability there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people sleep on his rushing ability, but between, Burrow getting his second chance in Cincinnati and Trevor Lawrence likely going to the Jaguars, it's, a lot of people are going to be putting a lot of chips in the Bengals and Jaguars offenses next year and hoping for some big time turnaround. But I'm excited for Burrow as well. So let's talk about some running backs because this was another one that was just unbelievably deep and probably not even the deepest position when we're talking about those rookies from last year. But Clyde Edwards-Helaire, DeAndre Swift, Jonathan Taylor, Cam Akers, J.K. Dobbins. Now we've got talks about A.J. Dillon taking over in Green Bay. We've got Antonio Gibson, James Robinson. If he doesn't get replaced, he's somebody to keep an eye out for. So what second-year running back are you most excited about, JJ?
I'm going to go with my guy here, Antonio Gibson. Someone I was super high on. One of the things that my prospect model for running backs looks at pretty heavily is the receiving component. It's not even because these guys translate as like great pass catchers at the NFL level, but it shows intent. It shows that teams were trying to get them the ball in different ways. And obviously Antonio Gibson, despite a lack of production in college, still graded out really well and looked really well in the model because, he played receiver essentially. And so what I'm really excited about with him is the fact that he only really has 1 year as a running back that we've seen from him. And he balled out. He was in like the 70th percentile or so when looking at runs that the percentage of runs that went 10 plus or 20 plus yards. That was in an offense that largely sucked. They were 25th in overall points this past year. The Washington offense was. You upgrade that offense in any way, which is not going to be difficult to do, then Gibson's going to be in a better situation. Does have some touchdown regression that should come, but he also has room to grow as a receiver, oddly. So I really, really love Antonio Gibson. I think I've mentioned him as a buy candidate in my podcast this week. He's RB15 according to Dynasty League Football ADP right now in Dynasty. I have him at RB9, so I'm very, very much into Antonio Gibson.
Yeah, the most frustrating thing with Gibson is you see this guy that played wide receiver in college and then he makes it to the pros and his running back counterpart is seeing 14 targets in a game and 11 targets in a game. It's just mind-numbing last year. Which,
by the way, J.D. McKissick is my father, if you guys weren't aware. He completely owned me on Twitter this year. I sent a tweet out. Oh, yeah, after the Darius Geis news, I sent a tweet out that said, that now Antonio Gibson's only competition is like a 34-year-old running back and a running back who weighs 190 pounds. And J.D. McKissick quote tweeted it and said, responded and said 198 with an asterisk. got his weight round. I got owned. I mean, there's nothing to it. I mean,
and then he put together a hell of a season too. I mean, I don't think anybody expected J.D. McKissick to have the year he did, but I mean, the numbers don't lie.
I'm sure every time he caught a pass, he remembered that tweet.
I'm sure. What about you, Troy? Which sophomore running back are you most excited about next year?
I believe there's some obvious choices, but I'm not going to go obvious. I believe a boring answer would be like Cam Akers, but I'm not going to go there. I'm saying James Robinson. James Robinson is my guy. Obviously, with Trevor Lawrence, he did everything he did with horrible QB play. Let's be honest. It was embarrassing what the Jaguars did, and he was still a bell cow. He was still the workhorse. If they're smart, they don't need to add anybody. I mean, they might add someone just to take a little bit of load off. I mean, he doesn't have to be 100% running back share every single game. So maybe they'll add this auxiliary piece. But obviously with Trevor Lawrence going there, Nick Saban, I believe he's going to be good for the offense. So I'm extremely excited for the Jags being on the rise. And I just believe that, James Robinson can add to what he was doing last year, just be more efficient. And it's going to be less pressure on him because think of it, they have to account now for Trevor Lawrence. They can't just focus on James Robinson anymore. And also Laviska Shenault is going to ball out too. But anyways, Robinson.
I'm behind the Laviska Shenault hype. I feel like Robinson, he could be one of those players that you could just keep buying low on for the next 3 or 4 years if he's able to keep it up. Chris Carson didn't have the draft pedigree. Arian Foster didn't have the draft pedigree. And these are RB1s that you were just able to grab consistently year in and year out in the second round. And it feels like Robinson, unless they draft somebody else or bring in a free agent to replace him, Robinson could very much so be that guy next year that you can draft in the second or third round that can put up top RB1 numbers. So let's get to the meat of this question because this wide receiver class was just bonkers, absolutely insane. Henry Ruggs, Jerry Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb, Jalen Reagor, Justin Jefferson, Brandon Ayuk, T. Higgins. Troy, you already called out Laviska Shenault. We've also got Michael Pittman, Chase Claypool, who we talked about. I can keep going on and on. I'm not even going to list them all because there are so many good ones. So, Troy, we'll start with you again on this one. Sophomore wide receivers, who are you most intrigued by about next year?
T. Higgins. It's got to be T. Higgins, man, because obviously he showed us, and with a healthy Burrow, sky's the limit for him. I don't expect A.J. Green to be there. And I just feel him is the wide receiver one on that offense. He already showed all of his potential. He's a monster. He's a beast. Everyone who's been following the game, if you've been watching him, you know how good he is. I don't really have to hype him up too much. I mean, Justin Jefferson, there's a bunch of candidates that would fit this number one, but it's got to be T. Higgins. I'm really excited about him.
Tough to argue against that. Who are you thinking, JJ?
Yeah, T. Higgins is definitely an awesome pick. I'm going to go with Laviska Shenault. He was someone coming out who sort of comped as an in-between A.J. Brown and Deebo Samuel type. And I mean, when he had the ball in his hands this year, you could see signs that he had some, that he was special in some way. You can throw him all over the field. I think that, this new regime in Jacksonville is going to find creative ways to use him. They need a complement for him. They might get another wide out there. I know DJ Chark is there too, but if they can get another piece there, I think it'll open things up and give him some more space as well. I'm just intrigued to see what happens in Jacksonville with Trevor Lawrence and that new regime and how they can figure out how to use Laviska Shenault in some creative ways.
Yeah, no, I'm very excited about Laviska Shenault. He's one of those guys where every mock draft or startup draft that I've done so far this year, you've got Laviska Shenault and DJ Chark. They're always getting drafted within a few picks of each other, and sometimes it's Shenault first, sometimes it's Chark first. Big things are going to be happening in Jacksonville once Trevor Lawrence shows up there. It's just who's going to be the guy, and I'm leaning with you. I think that it's got to be Shenault. He's just an absolute freak. Well, that'll wrap it up today. JJ, I want to thank you again for coming on and congratulate you once again on that FSWA award that you won yesterday. For anybody that hasn't checked out this podcast yet, we talked about it a lot on this show already today. It's just 15 to 20 minutes of easy to digest, just crammed to the absolute brim with stats and data. So definitely want to check that out. But JJ, why don't you let everyone know what you got going on this offseason, where they can find you and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, man, whole lot of late round podcast stuff for sure. And then obviously, all the content, the written stuff over on numberfire.com. And then, like I said, I have really bad tweets over on Twitter at Late Round QB.
And Troy, why don't you let everyone know where they can find you? I know you're cooking on a couple things right now. You got some big guests coming on the show with FF Confidential in the coming weeks. Why don't you let everybody know what's happening?
Sure. So y'all can find me at T King Mode. And yes, I'm one of the co-hosts of Fantasy Football Confidential. We air Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're doing every other Wednesday during the off season. We have big guests coming up. Y'all already know we had Barry and Harmon on the show. We're having Ryan Dow. We have Andy Behrens. We have Matt Wallman. We're going to have Marcus G from NFL Network coming on. We're going to have it. So I'm not going to spoil all the surprises, but it's going to be big. And I appreciate everybody, rocking with me and supporting us. So thank you.
Yeah, if you aren't following Troy already, do it right now. Troy is a budding superstar in this industry. Good friend of mine. It's been awesome getting to know you a little bit over the last year or so, Troy. And then a reminder that next week we're going to be bringing you this show again every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern time, and we're going to have Thor Nystrom, who is now no longer with Roto World, but now with NBC Edge. He's their lead college football writer and NFL draft analyst. So, rather than just talking about rookies, we're going to talk a little bit about what his process is and the things that he looks for when he's scouting these guys to hopefully help you think outside the box when it comes to making your rookie draft picks this year. So that's all I've got for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at DaveKluge_FF. And thank you for letting me intervene in your fantasy life. We're out.